Thank you. So, yep. Yes, military historian, but also a member of the Armed Forces for 20 years. Served in combat in Iraq at the height of the war there, unfortunately. It got worse when I arrived. General Petraeus probably blamed me personally for that. Defence acquisition of platforms and equipment is something that's dear to my heart. There's nothing worse than kit that doesn't work, or boots that leak, or rifles that don't fire when they've been dropped in the mud. So moving from the Lee Enfield 303 to the SLR, for example, is a pretty significant move. But let's look at some of the big platforms. So what World War II had done, it had changed the thinking of the Western powers in terms of what you need in the way of configuring your armed forces. Aircraft carriers, which to some people, particularly, for example, Captain D'Oyly Hughes, who's at the bottom of the sea off Norway, along with the carrier HMS Glorious, disagreed that aircraft carriers were a good idea. He thought battleships were a wonderful idea. At the end of World War II, most people had thought battleships have had their day, and indeed they had. The other thing that happened in World War II was submarines came to the fore, and of course there was a revolution in military aviation. So all of those things had to be taken into account as we move forward. I think we were lucky in that we had a lot of people in cabinet in both sides of the bench who'd served in the military themselves in World War II. John Gorton, for example, famously smashed his face up when he landed his fighter. Gough Whitlam was a navigator of bombers operating out of Northern Australia. So a lot of people had military knowledge, and I think that was part of the influence of what moved ahead. So it was the beginning of the jet age. In World War II, pretty well every fighter is a metal monoplane propeller-driven piston-engined fighter. As the 1950s dawned, those things are going to be off in the way of museums. We were operating a Mustang at the time, and we quickly graduated towards jets. Jets are a good thing. They enable faster speed, bigger payloads, and so on. And we moved into those and got into them in the Korean War. And so that enabled quite a bit of thinking about what we should do and moving ahead. The French Mirage was a very wise and good acquisition. Served us very well for a long time. And it was also somewhat controversial because it's French. And that's a topic, that's a part of my talk, which I'll embellish. Canberra bomber, British, very reliable, served in Vietnam, excellent aircraft, but eventually had to be superseded by the F-111. The F-111 had an enormous payload. The payload that you see there compared to the Canberra is actually wrong. It's 8,800 pounds in the bomb bay. But the F-111 had 4 external pylons that enable basically 36,000 pounds of bombs to be carried. It's also the only one of 2 bombers in the world at the time that has a nuclear weapon capability. So you may say to yourself, who do we want to drop nuclear weapons on? And obviously, if you have a nation to your north that may be hostile and that is enormous in its population, and obviously we're talking about Indonesia, that's something that you need to take into your thinking. The only other bomber that could make Jakarta and back with a nuclear weapon was the B-52. Strangely enough, the B-52 was being thought of as, okay, that's a bit World War II. It looks like the B-29, although it's got 8 engines. Interestingly, the B-52 is still with us today. The Hercules was acquired at the time, and the Hercules is still with us. We're now on the 4th generation of Hercules aircraft that we've had. And I've actually spent the last couple of years interviewing Hercules pilots and aircrew who went into Darwin with that venerable aircraft, and there's some of them having a kip in Cyclone Tracy. And that was the first aircraft to reach Darwin after the devastation of Cyclone Tracy in 1974. And they basically kept going for the next 3 weeks, shuttling people south and bringing in essential supplies north. And eventually that was supplemented with TAA and Qantas and so on. A wonderful aircraft, have flown in them myself. the C-130J in Iraq, and it has some interesting characteristics. There's nothing like, you'll never want to go back to the fairground again if you've done what they call a tactical descent in a Hercules, which basically means that from 30,000 feet you do a dive, a spiral dive, to get into a very short runway. And the reason you do that is because people are pointing surface-to-air missiles at you. Yes, and there's nothing more alarming than when you hear the weapons system going off from inside the Hercules. It sounds exactly like somebody is standing outside and banging a metal garbage bin with the lid, as in bang. And what that is actually the chaff, the seduction measures going off because somebody has pointed a surface-to-air missile at you, and it's blooming big heat-filled bits of aluminium to try and seduce the missile. In other words, the missile is going to miss you, hopefully. We entered the aircraft carrier age, and we'd never done that before. We acquired 3 aircraft carriers. One was on loan from the British for a while, that was Vengeance, while Melbourne was being changed around to that altered flight deck that you see there. Sydney had a straight flight deck, and she was changed into a commando carrier later. Aircraft carriers basically give you expeditionary force. You can go somewhere, you can stay there, and you can clobber them. And that is exactly what happened in the Korean War. You couldn't get enough firepower into Korea because of its geographical considerations, but if you deployed aircraft carriers, you could. So aircraft carriers are an excellent thing. They allow you to go places and stay there, particularly if they're nuclear powered, in a way which no other weapon system will. So this was a wonderful acquisition that we had, a really useful piece of kit. And I think probably one of the most tragic moments in Australian military history was when we decided in the Hawke era to not renew the fixed wing capability that we once had. We don't have a fixed wing capability at sea anymore. We have helicopter capability with those 2 very nice Navantia helicopter carriers that you usually see in Sydney. The Japanese are presently converting their helicopter carriers over to carry the F-35. Would that we do the same thing. We also acquired helicopters. There's the first helicopter the RAF ever had, very primitive looking device. But helicopters, interesting to think, really were something that only came of age in World War II. And they're an excellent thing to have, both on land, as you can see there. Do you see the little man on the left-hand side dangling under the helicopter? But also at sea, because you can hunt submarines with them, you can do all sorts of things with them. So we got into helicopters as well. And there's a helicopter at work in Cyclone Tracy. And again, there's somebody dangling underneath that one in the top one. We also entered the guided missile age, so ships changing over from gun to having missiles and missile defence measures. And this is interesting because we actually went to America to buy these 3 very, very capable, basically what you might call an air warfare destroyer. That's a really significant move for Australia. Particularly in naval circles, this was something that was almost regarded, and there were heated conversations in wardrooms around the world about this, as almost traitorous. We were moving away from the Royal Navy, which had been our mother navy, who had trained our officers from the formation of the RAN before World War I. So naval officers would be trained at Jervis Bay, HMAS Creswell, and they would then go to the Royal Navy for another couple of years of training, working in Royal Navy ships in actual officer postings. It takes years, it takes decades to grow a navy. You can't just grow it out of a box. It's the worst force of all in, basically, if you consider how to form an armed force, a naval force is the hardest of all. And that's why the British, for example, had a naval permanent force before they had a permanent army. It takes a long time to acquire them. So moving away from British technology, moving away from your mother navy, was something that was very, very much debated. But we bought these very capable destroyers and we started embracing the best technology. That is something I think the Menzies government deserves an enormous amount of credit for. They went after the best kit, no matter who you actually bought it from. Excellent destroyer, all male, by the way. No females ever served on this. And much weeping in the fleet when they were finally discarded only about 20 years ago. We got into submarines again. We'd actually had 3 waves of submarines before this. The first wave of submarines had served in World War I. One of them is sunk near Istanbul. I was over the top of it recently, the wreck's still there, and she had run amok, as they say, very capably in the Gallipoli campaign. The other one is sunk off New Guinea. We then had two more waves of submarines, British submarines, that didn't really work in the 1920s and early 30s. And eventually, because largely of the Great Depression, we made the decision to get out of submarining. A fairly foolish sort of attitude, I think, given they were so capable in World War II. But we then decided in the 1960s to get back into submarining again. It's a really good force multiplier. The best thing about submarines is the enemy doesn't know where they are. So if they go to sea and submerge and stay submerged, which is the best thing about nucleus, the enemy basically is faced with an ever-growing circle of where that submarine could be. And they have to defend against it, even though it's not there. So that takes them lots of time and effort that they could be spending in other ways to prosecute a war against you. So submarines are essential. We acquired the Oberons. There's two of them lit up for Christmas. They're an extremely capable hunter-killer submarine. I've just finished writing a 15,000-word paper for the Naval Historical Society about what they did in the Cold War. It was fairly difficult to write. I've got an intelligence background, so you don't particularly want to have things in the paper that creep in because you know them, that you really shouldn't have put them in there. So I basically had to classify every paragraph, as you used to do in the old days, with where I got it from. But they're an extremely capable and very quiet intelligence gatherer, following Russian destroyers and things like that into Kormoran Bay. So it was a sort of rather interesting thing to think about. But have a look at the numbers there that submarines were occupying in the minds of the Russians and of the USA. So you can see that the USA is well behind, but of course you add to those the French and the British and hopefully the Australian submarines. You can see that submarines are starting to dominate in terms of the platform that's important in the modern age, along with aircraft carriers. So before I move away from submarines, I should perhaps comment that the shambles that we then went into with the Collins class, which the Americans rescued us from, is now being followed by the shambles that we have with the nuclear acquisition program. Don't get me wrong, I love nuclear submarines. We should have had them 20 years ago, but we shouldn't be going about it this way. We should be just buying them off the shelf and not building them in Australia. In fact, I don't think we ever will build them in Australia. I think it will get cancelled. But that's beyond the scope of what I'm talking about here. So there's Vice Admiral Burrell. He's over in the USA talking about bits of kit. So I was talking before about acquiring the best platforms. Yes, these were British submarines, but we had got into American destroyers and we got into American guided weapons and so on. So you go somewhere to buy the best equipment. It's a difficult thing to do for Australia in the 1960s, but all credit, I think, to the Menzies government for being willing to do that. So there, for example, is one of the fighters that we were operating in World War II, along with things like the P-40 Kitty Hawk and so on. We're moving away from those. We did have items of kit that were, for example, the Grant tank from other countries in World War II, but now we're moving into buying major pieces of equipment. And so there's a table I'll let you look at of all the pieces of foreign equipment that we're starting to buy in the 1960s and 70s, and some of them, of course, are with us for 30 years, because a warship basically is something that you have for 30 years. Aircraft, of course, less, but a pretty considerable amount of stuff there. The P3 Orions, there's me about to get on board a P3 Orion for what, if I remember rightly, was an 11-hour submarine chasing flight. They do have bunks down the back, and a good thing too. A really capable aircraft, lovely aircraft, and we've only just started to get out of those and into a new generation of submarine maritime hunters. They're also capable of surface attack using Harpoon missile. Very, very capable aircraft. Had them in Darwin for a long time, and then strangely moved them back to Adelaide. I don't know why you base submarine chasing aircraft out of Adelaide. The reason was apparently that's where the aircrew want to live. They don't want to live in Darwin. It's also where the aircraft washing facility, would you believe, is, because a maritime aircraft needs washing after it comes home. And they've got this big warehouse that the aircraft is driven into and gets a spray. So the submarines there again, They went through basically the life of type extension, so they again acquired the ability to launch Harpoon from a submerged capability, which is pretty significant if you think about it. So they got upgraded. We were originally going to get 8, got 6 in the end. We also moved into this tank, which is British, a great tank, served in Vietnam and did very well, and then we got into the Leopard after that, another capable tank. And again, this time we made the right decision, we got into the Abrams. We're now getting into the Mark II version of the Abrams, and I think we're supposed to be giving the earlier ones to the Ukraine, if I remember rightly, the other day. A rather strange thing to do, but anyway. They serve very capable in Vietnam. As did the armoured personnel carriers. If you've seen the movie about the Battle of Long Tan, this is the carrier that comes to the aid of the boys in the firefight in the rain. And strangely enough, some of them are still serving. They're basically a box to get your troops into the battlefield without getting dead. They're not a tank. The argument goes that do you really need to upgrade what basically is a track box? We did put bar armour around them because new missiles basically can go through the armour they've got. They should be replaced, but very capable. And finishing up, here's something that's very, very sort of a small thing to think about, but very, very important. We decided to invest in a new assault rifle. And basically what we had in World War I and World War II was the Lee Enfield 303. It's a 10-round bolt-operated magazine-fed rifle, very accurate, very, very reliable. The definition of reliable in terms of an assault rifle is drop it in a pool of liquid mud, leave it there for 30 seconds, completely submerged, get it out and then do what they call a field strip to it. A field strip is what any soldier can do. You basically take it apart to its fundamental pieces and put it back together again after a quick clean. Does it fire? The Lee Enfield 303 does that. So replacing something with the SLR, which you see there, is a big step. It's a big step forward. And should it be done? And we've now replaced the SLR with the F-88 Steyr, which I carried myself in battle. I think the SLR was slightly less efficient than the Lee Enfield, but it's semi-automatic, which means it fires around every time you pull the trigger. So it's fast to fire. You can also convert it to automatic, so it's like a light machine gun. The F-88 has a telescopic sight, and when I first fired one, I thought this is a complete disaster because the sight will go out of alignment and it won't be accurate. That's not right. It's a very, very good rifle. So we moved into that, and the SLR served us very capably in Vietnam. We also looked at other light weapons, and they're quite often dismissed because the big pieces of kit are the expensive ones and they get the attention. But if you look at the list there, you can see all of these new pieces of kit that came in as we had the Menzies government involved in Vietnam, and very reliable they are. Some of them, of course, not necessarily British. So, it's an impressive defence legacy, and there's me congratulating the great man on the shores of Lake Burley-Griffin a couple of weeks ago. But as you can see, it's a set of decisions that are well thought out and far-reaching and wise. They weren't afraid to make the right decisions, which I think is significant. Submarines and aircraft carriers, I think, are the most significant purchases that they made, and would that we had such capable weapons in modern terms today. I'm not sure where we're going with that, but they didn't neglect the smaller stuff. A great set of decision makers, a great government in terms of defence acquisitions. Would we have the same today? Thank you. All the questions for the last one. Yeah, over here.
Hello, Dr. Lewis. Thank you very much. My name's Karen Darlitz.
Hi.
I'm fascinated that you regard the legacy of World War II as the weapons of war. And I'd like to question you about the people who survived World War II and what Menzies offered them in terms of compensation, because they came home damaged, they weren't able to fit into family life again, they weren't fully employable, and their children were quite disadvantaged by having parents who came back so destroyed.
Right. I think that's an interesting assumption. My wife's sitting over there, and her dad was a soldier in World War II, and when he came home, he was a soldier settler. He was given land because he was a soldier in World War II, and he could have as much land as he wanted as long as he could fence it within a year, if I remember rightly. It's not necessarily the case that everybody who serves in battle comes home wounded. In fact, and I've written a book on this, it's called Lethality in Combat. It's just been republished as The Truth of War, which is battlefield behaviours in reality. It's not the case that everybody dislikes going to war. Some people, especially men, some people regard it as something that you do. It's part of being a human. Being a soldier is a good thing. Think of it this way. If you're a soldier, if you're a military person and you train all your life, it's like training for a rugby match all your life and never actually playing in a rugby match. So you want to go off to see if you can actually do it. Warfare can be extremely unpleasant. I found it so. I didn't enjoy being shot at. I nearly got killed a couple of times. It was, however, what I call surreal. I think the worst thing in combat is you just wonder the first time, are you going to run away screaming? Everybody has that doubt. But yes, in terms of what the Menzies government did for those people who returned, you did have the soldier settler scheme. But I think in those days there was also an attitude of when you come back from a war, you just put down the sword and you pick up the plough. It's what you do. So I don't blame them for what they didn't do, if that's what you're getting at. Yes, I'm not sure I understand what you're saying.
Well, really what I was asking is... thank you. To me, the legacy is the people. War is all about killing people. And so what is the legacy of people who've tried to be killed or have done killing? And what was the Menzies' approach to that? How did he help those who returned so that they could engage? The Soldier Settlers program, great. But I'm really quite a supporter of Jackie Lambie and what she's been doing in recent years, questioning compensation for returned soldiers and people even in your position, because you can come back very fragile and also with physical and mental injuries.
Yeah, I think it was, however, a different time. The attitude that they had then was different to what they have today. Maybe they had the wrong attitude, but I think also there was an attitude in the world. We've won the war, we've saved ourselves from invasion. It cost, yeah, we lost nearly, 40,000 people in World War II. It cost, but it was better than the alternative.
Thank you, Doctor. So I have a question slightly different to this subject. So as an expert, do you have any lesson or are you surprised from the recent Ukraine war from like weapon or even the tactics standpoint?
A friend of mine who's also a military historian follows it very closely. I haven't. My attitude towards these things, I used to get paid a lot of money as an intelligence analyst to follow things and write papers on them and have them published in a sort of classified form, and hopefully somebody in power would read them. I'm not in that business anymore. I haven't really followed the Ukraine that much. My friend who has points out that the Ukraine's lost about 25% of their territory. They're not going to get it back. And his attitude is that they've been propped up by the West to spend their own lives trying to keep this war going for maybe the West's own reasons. He thinks basically that they should sue for peace. I think he may be right. Yeah.
Thank you. This is really putting two papers together. So the first paper was about changing strategic thinking. Your paper is about the acquisition of kit, equipment. Partly coming back to that first question, I suppose the other thing that's going on through this period of the Menzies government is the move towards a professionalised standing army, and an army which is, I suppose, coming back to that the first of papers on the military, but was that this is an army that is premised on a war-fighting capacity, whether it's a continental defence war or whether it's an expeditionary war. To what extent, I mean, is there something that you'd like to say about the significance of that transition and even understanding the ADF as a professionalised standing army, not the recruitment-based army, the temporary army of the Second World War, but the kind of army that is being reconfigured and tested through this period on the assumption that what we are going to be prepared for is a war, even though, as I understand it, so many of the tensions in the army now are, well, we're doing so many other things than fighting war, and how consistent are they with our training? Again, going back to the point you just made, with our ethos.
I think the army, the armed forces that were formed under Menzies were the beginning of a good professional capability-driven set that we have today. We made the decision not to go down the road of the Indonesians or the Chinese. The Indonesians, last time I looked, have 400,000 people in uniform in their armed forces. Their navy in uniform is 3 times the size of ours. They have 60,000 people in it. It's awful. It basically doesn't work. I have exercised with the Indonesians and they are frightening. They are muzzle unaware, their missiles don't go off when they should, and they do go off when they shouldn't. Don't get me started. So we didn't go down the road of having massed numbers. We went down the road of having high capability kit. I think it works. We have made substantial mistakes. We should have stayed, as I said, in the fixed-wing business with aircraft carriers, and we should have had nuclear submarines 20 years ago. They should have been American, and we should have just bought them off the production line. But for various political reasons, of course, that most of you would know better than I, we have not done that. But we have arrived at an armed force which is pretty good. I've been to war with the Australian forces, though I served almost all my time with the Americans in Iraq. And the Australians are pretty good. They stack up very well. There's a saying in the American forces, stay in your lane. And what that means is if the Humvee breaks down, you just basically get on the radio and call a mechanic. The British, of course, will be by the side of the Humvee making tea. The Australians will have the bonnet up and be trying to fix it. So the Australians do have a very good capability mindset in the field. They're basically sort of all about initiative, which is great. So I commend the Australian forces for that. If you want, however, to sort of go down that road of talking about are the armed forces good for stuff like firefighting, I think you can make a big mistake there. People don't join armed forces to give out ration packs in bushfires for weeks on end. They just don't. We're having an enormous amount of problems now attracting people and getting them to stay in the armed forces. We could do a lot more with that. For example, why don't we simply remove income tax from all members of the ADF? Just do it. Just do it. Something simple like that. How hard is that? And I suppose, concluding on a theme that might be sort of enjoyable for some of you in this room, the woke attitude that has penetrated the armed forces is driving people away. I know a lot of people I serve with who are still in. The attitude of an armed force that's being told to pursue net zero, to have, I don't know, electric tanks or something, that sort of thing is driving people away. And to give you an example, when I joined the armed forces, I had to do 2 things every year: pass my medical and pass my shooting test. As an officer, I had to pass pistol and rifle. They were the only 2 things I had to do. When I left, I had something like 36 compulsory hours of education to do every year. 3 hours of suicide awareness. I mean, and this was somebody who'd been in for 20 years, and beside me is sitting an admiral who's been in for 40. He has to do it too. And on the other side is a new private who's been in for 3 weeks, and he's doing the same program. So there's certainly quite a few things we could do with our armed forces to improve them.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks.
We break now for morning tea, and then we reconvene at 11.